Hi everyone! This video discusses the language of Metroidvania as it pertains to space, specifically mazes and labyrinths. A classical labyrinth is a complex system with one set path. A maze has multiple paths by which to reach the center. I wish to add that not all Metroidvania obey the classical form of the labyrinth. Some have no center to move towards, but simply unfold from beginning to end, as Castlevania does. A traditional maze can have several entrance points and no center. Many Metroidvania with maze-like properties have only one point of entry and a center where the final boss is found. Killing this boss is the only way to escape. This video is part 2 of my Metroidvania series and a follow-up to my first video. In that video, I discussed Metroidvania and what I think they are. To summarize, I define Metroidvania as follows. The portmanteau Metroidvania equals Metroid plus Vania. I focus on space, so for me, Metroid doesn't equal the franchise, Metroid. Metroid equals that franchise's unique treatment of space, mazes. Vania doesn't equal the franchise Castlevania, it equals that franchise's treatment of space, the labyrinth. At the same time, Metroid, or Metro plus Oid, means Android City. Castlevania, or Castle plus Vania, means Other Castle, Demon Castle, or Castle Dracula. And the portmanteau Metroidvania essentially combines all of these things, Android City, Demon Castle, Maze, and Labyrinth. In other words, Metroidvania is inclusive, with a number of definitions. The narrow definition used to describe Symphony of the Night in 1997, a Castlevania game, plus Super Metroid's map system. Jeremy Parish's broader definition from 2006, quote, a video game genre which combines 2D side-scrolling action with free-roaming exploration and progressive skill and item collection to enable further progress. And third, the commodified term, which includes a wide variety of titles related to either Metroid or Castlevania, but also sequels and spiritual successors, a broad, all-inclusive taxon. This third definition is the most relevant in terms of what is being made and sold today. If an indie developer makes a Metroidvania, it can be something like Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight has a maze-like world that also features elements from newer games. Its blacksmith, currency, and respawn systems pointedly resemble Dark Souls. While Hollow Knight's vast nonlinear game world seems to as well, its 3D predecessor drew clear inspiration from Metroid and other 2D games. My interest in Metroidvania is equally pointed. What I care about and use to analyze Metroidvania is space, not combat mechanics. Is a Metroidvania a maze or a labyrinth? It can be either, so this question will need to be asked on an individual basis. It gets tricky though, because the language used to label the game in question doesn't always indicate which type of space we're dealing with. When Metroid and Castlevania were published, they were marketed as action-adventure, or as a specific form of action, 2D platformer, side-scroller, or a combination of either of these genres with the former adjective, 2D action platformer, something like that. A huge element, of course, is left out, the kind of space that makes either game and future iterations unique, spatially. Metroid is a maze. However, it isn't strictly a maze game like Cat and Mouse, nor is it something I would recommend marketing in the puzzle category. The problem remains. While Metroid incorporates action elements of the platformer side-scrolling sort, it does so inside a maze. This maze is the franchise's biggest draw, and why it became famous. Game development complicates matters. Developers can pick and choose how a game plays out and what the player runs into while inside. And this brings us to the problem of portmanteaus and Metroidvania as a generalized taxon. To call a game Metroidvania is to highlight the fact that it contains something distinct from Metroid or Castlevania, but also games styled after them, which only borrow bits and pieces. The point is, it's entirely possible to call Shantae Metroidvania, or Bloodstained Curse of the Moon. Each borrows something from the classics. However, this could be the monsters, the setting, or a particular kind of space. The Metroidvania commodity promotes specific forms of action-adventure inside different kinds of space associated with Castlevania or Metroid. Another problem is evolution. As these franchises evolve, they sometimes swap the kinds of space they use. Castlevania is linear, straightforward. Metroid is not. Later on, Metroid Fusion is linear, straightforward. Symphony of the Night is not. These kinds of space are tied up in certain Gothic forms of storytelling, horror and terror. Horror is straightforward and confronts monsters and disgusting things. It shocks. Terror leaves room to imagine, its evils relegated to the shadows. Except, in video games, a space needs to be designed a particular way to achieve these results. If a space is linear, the player will run into monsters more often. If a space is maze-like, the player will spend more time moving around trying to get from point A to point B. This doesn't mean that combat is non-existent in mazes. It simply happens less often in Metroid than it does in Castlevania. This presents yet another issue. Mazes and labyrinths can both contain horrifying and terrifying elements. Metroid Fusion goes to great lengths to tease out its evils, before forcing Samus into a boss chamber to do battle. Super Metroid pits the player against 4 mini-bosses Samus must defeat before proceeding. Both games are spatially horrifying and terrifying. The core difference is to what degree, how linear or non-linear are these structures. Yet, there's another problem. The current state of gaming language. The most popular, productive franchises are described as horror, specifically survival horror. This generally splits games into 2 basic types, horror and non-horror, except non-horror implies a lack of content most Metroid and Metroidvania games have in some shape or form. While non-horror is technically accurate, it would be more accurate to describe maze-like Metroidvania as terrifying. In this sense, they remain related to horror titles. Except terror is not distinctly used in marketing language. The words terror and horror are treated as synonymous, when they should be seen as alternatives to one another. Metroidvania is an inclusive category that has grown substantially in recent years. Personally, I've never had an issue with the term, but I do acknowledge how confusing it can be. This being said, Metroidvania structurally offer the player a chance to deal with different kinds of fears. Not only are these fears spatially arranged, they are preceded by labels that can never exactly specify what the player is dealing with. Something is always left out. Early Metroid titles are all 2D action platformers, but uniquely amid commonalities. These games also belong to the broader Metroidvania taxon, a taxon that also does little to distinguish them. Metroidvania need to be examined individually. This includes how maze-like or linear their spaces are. Some people might find this annoying, but there is no such thing as a perfect word, and if there were, would you even want to use it? My favorite aspect of Metroidvania, from an advertising standpoint, is their vagueness. You're given an idea of what to expect, often spelled out in mist, blood, or slime. The box art can never fully realize what the game actually produces when played, and there's a certain delight, I think, in being titillated by an incomplete signpost. As stated earlier, my interest lies in maze-like Metroidvania. This means that however they appear, the game worlds are ultimately non-linear, and subject to sequence breaks, reverse boss order, and low-percent playthroughs. From a classic standpoint, this means they are most comparable to Metroid, Super Metroid, and Metroid Fusion. What about other Metroidvania, games like Metroid Fusion or Axiom Verge that force the player into a labyrinthine space? To complete the game, you must go through extended portions of linear space wherein sequence breaks, reverse boss order, and low percent are impossible. Open-ended sequences towards the end are extracurricular, non-essential. What ultimately determines a Metroidvania's mazeness are 3 sequences: the start, the middle, and the end, but mainly the middle. The start is what I consider to be the collection of essential items, power-ups you'll need to use for the entire game. Mid-game is the meat of the experience. The end sequence makes the win condition available to the player. I mention item collection relative to these sequences because they are a core element of Metroidvania play, hence determine what kind of space the player is dealing with. In Metroid, for example, the morph ball, bomb, and missiles are essential, and the player can acquire all of them rather quickly. Apart from these, however, there are few items you actually need to complete the game. One of them is Ice Beam, which is required to kill Metroids, thus gain access to Mother Brain, the game's end condition. Large portions of the game can be played without it, though. Like many Metroid power-ups, this is a mid-game collectible. Item collection allows the player to leave the start and enter the middle sequence. This section, I argue, determines whether or not a Metroidvania is a maze. If the majority of the game allows for sequence breaks, reverse boss order, and low percent, then it is a maze. If not, it is a labyrinth. A Metroidvania can be either. This operates according to the current usage of Metroidvania, as a commodity. Because Metroidvania is an inclusive term, it continues to illustrate a staggering potential for different kinds of video games. These grow and develop under its banner as time goes on. Metroidvania is merely a starting point, but an important one. It gives you an idea of what to expect. From there, you'll need to enter and see how they work for yourself. Contrary to what others might argue, this only adds to Metroidvania's die-hard appeal. Often used in retrospect, the blanket term is frequently associated with some of the greatest games of all time. And in light of recent indie successes, this quality remains equally possible in future video games. Hearing Metroidvania spoken, you think of the horrors and the terrors, the monsters and the minions, the mazes and the labyrinths. In this sense, a Metroidvania is a box of chocolates. You're not quite sure what you're going to get, but you have a pretty good idea. All the same, it can go a lot of different ways, taking away some of the predictability while providing something for everyone. This type of chaos doesn't prohibit the sale of chocolate. If anything, it's all the more reason people make the purchase. Metroidvania is a broad, inclusive term, requiring copious research if you want to know exactly what you're getting. However, this also applies to any game type I can think of: first-person shooter, dungeon crawler, roguelite, etc. And like those games, buying the game and trying it blind is another part of the fun. It only sucks when the game doesn't deliver in some shape or form. For those with a broader palette, whether the space inside is a maze or a labyrinth matters less than the fact that the game is enjoyable. And though there are gamers out there who are pickier, I can imagine just as many who enjoy a good story inside an android city or a demon castle. If the combat is good, fans will come back. If the space is maze-like, fans will come back. It might be different fans, but I would argue they belong to the same overall family. This ends the video. Future installments are in the works, so stay tuned. If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe to my channel. You can also support me on Patreon, where I not only produce YouTube videos, but artwork and blog posts. The content I create is aided by your support and lets me write, shoot, and draw about horror, heavy metal, and Metroidvania. Stay tuned.